US dropping out of diplomacy. It's been such an important force in the run-up to the Paris Agreement. It was actually China and US working together that really got the Paris Agreement over the line. And they sort of then dropped out. The energy transition has made so much progress. The price of EVs has come right down. The price of renewable electricity has come right down. Brexit dropped the UK out of EU, obviously, and sort of changes the dynamic there on the diplomacy side. But you know, the UK has traditionally been good at that diplomacy role and has shown signs of wanting to work with Brazil and the UAE as they go into this COP. So hopefully that plays out positively.
The governments are prioritizing short-term economic and political needs versus climate.
Yeah, there's a lot of money that goes into climate misinformation. There's a narrative that climate costs more money.
Welcome to another episode of Planet People Profit. I'm your host Sudipto Dey, and today we have the privilege to welcome a visionary guest, Helen Clarkson. Helen brings with her over 25 years of experience in advocating humanitarian and climate issues. She serves as the CEO of Climate Group, which works with governments and businesses across the globe, helping them achieve their net zero goals. In 2022, Helen was honored with the Order of British Empire. In 2024, she earned a slot in the Independent's Climate 100 list. Helen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You know, as I'm going through your LinkedIn profile and your, I was curious to understand, from a chartered accountant, CA, to a climate activist, another CA, So how did this switch happen?
Well, actually, I went into chartered accountancy with a view to, I knew I wanted a mission-driven career. I wanted to go into non-profits. And my degree was in philosophy. And I thought, that's not such a useful skill. I think philosophers are important in the world, but I thought, maybe good to have something practical to offer the world of non-profits and so on. So I actually trained as an accountant, but I left, I think, about 6 months after I qualified in order to move into mission-driven work. And I went to work for Médecins Sans Frontières, a big global humanitarian agency. I took 6 months traveling first. That was fun. And then I went. So I then worked for Médecins Sans Frontières. Initially, I did finance for them, but then I moved into sort of project management role, which again, uses skills like budgeting. So I've always found it really useful to have that skill set behind me. But no, I didn't ever want to be an accountant. I wanted to be, but it's useful now as CEO because, I'm not sure if my, CFO finds it great that I can have a conversation with him. I'm like, but what about the balance sheet? And he's like, she understands it. So, but it is a useful skill. But
the fact that you had a stint in the corporate sector for some time at least, does that help you in the understanding the climate issues or the taking up some of the, especially the finance issues related to climate? Yeah,
I wouldn't claim to be a big finance expert. And that's definitely the bit where, when people are talking that finance, I have to stop and think quite hard, and there's people with real expertise in, how do you structure finance deals and stuff. But I think it's given me a grounding in, why businesses might think like they do and therefore how to get that business case to them. And I think it's, I'm a very pragmatic person and I've always had the view that, for me, climate mission-related issues are very sort of core to how I think. I get that business has a different set of drivers or way of thinking about the world, and it's useful to have had that background in, why do businesses think that shareholders are, shareholder primacy? It's actually a myth, and it's been wildly overinterpreted, I think, which is a whole nother conversation. But at least it's kind of given me a background more in, this is where businesses start from. And so if you can get into the business case, and I think that's really helped as we sort of where we are on climate now, which is kind of endlessly making the business case.
So it has come in handy. Yeah,
it has come in handy, as I say, both for running my own organization and being able to understand what I'm looking at on the page and then engaging with businesses, yes. But it's a long time in my past now, so occasionally I have to think, what would a double entry be? But it's very rare that I have to kind of really put my brain into that. Yeah,
absolutely. And I'm sure, as a CEO of an organization which is so widespread, I'm pretty sure it's more than handy. But tell me one thing, like, something which we just can't miss talking about is, the Trump effect.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure this is being asked and been talked about in the climate circles, widely.
Yeah.
The Trump effect, how does it change the balance of green power? Or has it really changed the balance of green power?
Unfortunately, I think it has. And I think what's difficult at the moment is, I often forget, we're only sort of 6 weeks into this. It feels like 6 years. It's just so much has happened. I think the problem is that we knew we had a playbook last time, which worked quite well. Businesses carried on doing what they were doing. States and regions carried on doing what they were doing. We saw a lot of states in the US actually kind of being very ambitious and pushing forward. And so I think there was a slight feeling, well, we'll just kind of replay 2017 to 2021. It's working out already quite different. So let's start with the US domestic emissions. US accounts for about 10% of global emissions. So already, if the US isn't going to tackle its own emissions in the next few years, that is a big problem for the globe. We know that emissions are global. And so, the US not tackling that is in itself a problem. The second thing which we sort of foresaw coming is US dropping out of diplomacy. It's been such an important force in the run up to the Paris Agreement. So it was actually China and US working together that really got the Paris Agreement over the line, with French diplomacy and so on. But it was critical that, the team working on Paris brought China and US along. So, and they sort of then dropped out under Trump last time, came back in with Biden. So it's tricky because you sort of also, there's a lot of like, well, in 4 years when they're back, and you sort of think, well, actually, they've got to have another election. It's not sure that they're back. Okay, so that's a big issue. But I think what we hadn't foreseen, no one, as far as I know, foresaw, was this pulling this US aid money so quickly, which in a way you think, well, that's remote to climate, maybe. But actually what's going to happen now is philanthropies are going to fill that gap, which again means there's less money for climate. So there's a kind of knock-on effect of unforeseen things, which, are really causing the disturbance in terms of how is this actually going to work? Who's going to pay for what? What are the philanthropies going to do? How does this affect my project? So we've already had, very small, but like one project where a donor has had to say, look, we're going to have to put that on hold while we look at, do we need to plug that money over here? And we're just, a small cog in this. So it's caused this huge amount of disruption. On the diplomacy front, I think that obviously the big worry is, does this now empower other countries to say, well, actually, we're not interested in sticking with Paris either. And that's going to play out through this round of NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. Countries have to revise them this year. Mostly they're late at the moment. They're supposed to have done them by February. So I think that's going to be very telling. Does it start to knock on through that and countries start to sort of really look inwards, which will be a big mistake.
Mr. Trump has also already sort of rolled back some of the environment regulations in the US. Of course, that will mean that the cost of compliance would come down for business. But it's also a test for their the corporate resolutions that they made out for their climate action. And it's a test case, is a litmus test, I would say. For them that whatever you promised, are you really going to stand up to this promise? You see that playing out?
I mean, it's early days, I'd say. As I say, we're sort of 6 weeks into this, and I haven't seen so far a company come out and say, right, we're dropping. You've seen the banks sort of roll back. Some of that is in the language they're using, right? So some of them will just sort of, rewrite their annual report and drop certain terms. In that period, I thought it was really interesting. JP Morgan put out a document about risk and climate and saying, well, look, we've got to think about it. So there's, and that they weren't doing that as an act of resilience. That's just a business point of view that companies need to understand the climate risk. So I think, everyone's understanding of climate risk has deepened. We're probably still not valuing it correctly. But for a lot of businesses, they know this. They know they've got to react to it. They know that their longevity relies on them having plans for climate or dealing with it. So I think some of what we're going to see is language changing rather than commitments changing, I hope. Of course, we're going to see some companies step back, where they were sort of doing it for not particularly deep reasons. But I think we are still going to see companies doing it, but maybe more quietly, which is problematic because, partly what we run very public campaigns and we want companies to say, we're doing this, and want to encourage others to do that. So that's difficult. So far I haven't seen them dropping it. Maybe there's some rewording, but it's going to be, what do we see from the banks and so on? Certainly the fossil fuel companies are going to use it as an excuse to, and we're already seeing that, to drop theirs, but that some of those were quite, let's say, lightly held commitments anyway.
There's been, do you think the way Mr. Trump has gone about, will there be question marks on investments on the EV, which is essentially the EV and the renewable energy? A lot of investments we have seen over the last few years. You see some impact on those investments, some question marks around those investments going forward?
Much less, I think, actually, because I think this is a really key part of what's different between 2017 and now, right, is that the energy transition has made so much progress. The price of EVs has come right down. The price of renewable electricity has come right down. The International Energy Agency has said solar is the cheapest form of energy in history. Yeah. So just those sort of plain economics have radically changed since in the last few years. Also, look what's happening in China. So, I mean, China's a really key player now in all of this, always was in terms of sort of manufacturing, and is making, the sheer volume of electric vehicles that are coming out of China now and are being sold in Western markets. I mean, you didn't see that a few years ago. It's been so quick. The rise in, I was actually talking to a car salesman before Christmas. He's like, oh, everyone loves these BYDs. Now, I don't think you'd have caught anyone in the UK buying a Chinese car 5 years ago. It just wasn't like, what even are they? It was very kind of domestic. Those economics have changed radically. The quality of what's coming out, just the range on those vehicles is amazing. And so I don't think you can put that genie back in the bottle. And I think that's what people are sort of hanging on to in a way as well, is just the market economics, how cheap it is, so easy now to roll out and solar and other things. So I think that will keep things moving along. I think the things which are challenging, as you get into the kind of heavy industries and those harder to abate, which are just starting to move, do we still get the same level of progress on sort of steel decarbonisation if the US isn't in the mix? Interestingly,
also a fallout of the Trump effect, I would say that, it opens up space for EU and the European Union and the United Kingdom to have much more larger say in the climate narrative, driving the whole climate action movement.
Yeah.
You see that happening. You see UK coming forward and, taking up the space which US is sort of, giving up.
Yes, I think you can see it starting to take the first step. So put out an early NDC, put out an ambitious NDC. Yeah. We've heard and we've seen kind of, that UK diplomatic piece, which has always been good at kind of taking a step up. Will what's happening in Ukraine right now sort of derail that? I don't know. I think that's the kind of, again, it's these kind of wild swan events, I think they're called. We seem to have had sort of 5 since the new year. I've lost count really. But so I think that's interesting. I think the EU has always been the climate leader, and then it sort of needed the US pulling along with it, maybe slightly behind in terms of what it's willing to commit to, but putting that diplomatic voice behind it. So I think the tricky thing now is like von der Leyen is clearly committed on this issue, but she's getting pressure from kind of the populists that are coming into the kind of EU mix as well. I think Tusk in Poland is going to be really important. So I think there's really good committed people in the EU, and what we want to see as well is just them kind of keeping it up. And then I think what will be interesting is how do they resist that kind of populist push on the right, but also how do you now start to see the EU, India, China, Brazil obviously hosting the COP this year. What are those diplomatic links like? And of course the UK, Brexit, which I don't really like to talk about too much, but sort of personally, but it's dropped the UK out of the EU obviously, and sort of changes the dynamic there on the diplomacy side. But the UK has traditionally been good at that diplomacy role and has shown signs of wanting to work with Brazil and the UAE as they go into this COP. So hopefully that plays out positively.
But you see UK working closely with EU, I would say.
Yes,
the
you
history,
do actually. I mean, that might be the flip side of the Ukraine thing. They seem to be friends again now.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of water under that bridge. I don't even know if that's the right. It's a flood under the bridge, but you know, it's like.
I hope the bridge holds it.
Can the bridge hold? But yeah, no, you can see that. You know, gosh, you're going to extend this metaphor, but like, it's been interesting to watch kind of Macron and Starmer kind of getting closer to each other, and of course the new German chancellor coming in. So it's going to be one to watch. But yeah, that is where the hope lies. And of course, that EU legislation, things like CBAM, have been so critical for sending a signal or driving change in the export economies across Asia, for instance. You know, we do a lot of work in South Korea, and they can see CBAM coming, and yeah, they find it painful. But again, it's setting a very clear direction for the future, and that allows you as businesses to innovate or understand where you need to get to. And those signals and the kind of that sense of this legislation is coming in 4 or 5 years, whenever it's going to come.
Exactly.
It sort of sets out that path of how we're going to get to 2050.
Interesting. You know, but there's one elephant in the room.
I feel like there's loads of elephants in the room.
Yeah, actually, there are quite a few elephants in the room. But one, it's been sort of whispered about. Of course, is the subsidy given to fossil fuel. You know, as per our research, what is very often quoted for research is 620 billion. 2023 was given out by different governments globally to subsidize use of fossil fuel. Yeah. While the comparative figure for, say, support for clean energy was, I think, $70 billion. Yeah. You know, that's a huge gap. The point is that, first of all, it's an unequal fight. Yeah. You know, and secondly, also, of course, it brings down the cost of energy, you know, the subsidy. But it is an unequal fight. But also, there's a political angle to it. You know, the governments are prioritizing, short-term economic and political needs, versus climate. Yeah. You know, how do you think this is going to play out? And is there a road map or road ahead for, bringing down the subsidies for fossil fuel? Because
I think this is. I mean, I wish I had a better answer, because this is the absolutely critical thing, and we and others have been saying we've got to address this. Yes. Because the other thing is the way that plays out politically is there's a lot of money that goes into climate misinformation. Yeah. And so the narrative, and I don't want to preempt talking later about myths that you want to bust or whatever, but there's a narrative that climate costs more money. Mm-hmm. That comes directly out of the mouths of the fossil fuel industry. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist in any way. I'm always, I'm always like, no, there's no big conspiracy. On that one, you can trace it back to fossil fuel money going into climate misinformation and sort of getting a real kind of getting everyone questioning. And I think one of the issues there is it's very easy to put narratives out that say net zero is money, net zero costs more, whatever. Yeah. On our kind of side of it, we then tend to fight back with graphs. And that's the bit that I think is so, like, where we have lost the narrative as a climate world is, with like, oh no, but if I show you one more graph, then you'll change behavior. And then on the other side, you've got people going, net zero equals money. Don't take my money away. And everyone's like, I don't want to take my money away. Or, these people want to take. There was a whole thing, maybe like 2 years ago in the States, where there was some Democratic run cities put out a ban on gas hookups in new buildings. So basically you're saying, right, we need to electrify the world. Let's start with new build, electrify everything. Let's not put natural gas into buildings. You can cook on electricity, especially the States have a real issue on switching to electric because of their voltage. That's a whole thing. Whereas in the UK, you can just essentially plug an induction oven in. And I assume you could hear because it's higher voltage. So, but if you build it from the start in the US, you can do it, right? So these Democrat cities, like, right, here's an ordinance. This seems very straightforward. Electrify the buildings. Those ones that were in then kind of Republican states, you saw the states saying, no, this is curbing our liberty. So they go straight to that word and passed laws saying that cities could not pass these ordinances. And then it got into a culture war fight. The Democrats are coming for your gas stove. And you saw this crazy stuff happening in, really serious media, prize my gas stove out of my cold, dead hands sort of thing. And all that stuff is really kind of coordinated, funded, like you get into this stuff which makes climate into a culture war issue, and somehow we're arguing about gas stoves, and which are highly polluting, by the way, come to air quality.
Exactly.
The evidence about kind of asthma and internal cooking on gas, which we've all done for years, it's crazy, but somehow there's been very clever ways of just getting hold of that narrative and striking right at the heart of what people care about, which is personal freedom or whatever. So I think that, we were talking about fossil fuel subsidies, but the sheer amount of money that is in those industries in order and the way that they're going about protecting very short-term industry profits and so on is it's the thing that we really need to tackle. And the other issue is that the business models around renewable energy are harder, so it's a big one.
But just to understand, you see, as we go down the energy transition pathway, do consumers and businesses, do they need to be incentivized? I mean, say, how important is it to give financial incentives to consumer businesses to go down the energy pathway?
Yeah, I think on the electric vehicle front, that has been incredibly important to get over that, because you always have that, first mover price. It's always going to be more expensive until you get things up to scale. And so you could see in Europe that actually incentivizing, getting rid of that first chunk of cost for electric vehicles was what kind of got them going. And I think they withdrew, a lot of countries withdrew those subsidies far, far, far too quickly. The market hadn't quite tipped. So I think there are sensible incentives that you can put in. I mean, Norway now it's heavily incentivized electric vehicles, and they're getting to, really up and over 50%. I think almost all new vehicles sold there now are electric or some incredible number. And so you can see what the role of incentives are to change the economy. I think the problem one of the problems we've got is that renewable energy is incredibly cheap, but that is not yet being passed on to the consumer. And that's very different in different markets. In the UK, we have a subsidy on the electricity part of our bill called the green tariff. But electricity is what we want people to use. So what you should be doing is putting that green tariff onto the gas part of, we have these dual bills, because you want to stop gas and incentivize electricity. So we've just got it the wrong way around. But on the other hand, if you put it on the gas piece of the bill, that would be regressive. But so governments are really wrestling with things. But I think we need to have much more, markets need to look at these kind of very sensible incentives. Like, how do we get from A to B? And that's where you come back to needing these long-term plans, because that will help you set out how do we progress. That is what the UK is good at, is because we've got the Climate Change Act, and that says that we have to pass, Parliament has to pass carbon budgets every 5 years. There's something called the UK Climate Change Committee. They sort of put the advice together. They published their latest last week for 2038 to 42. So it is that really long-term look of like, what do we think is coming, but also what technologies do we have now, or how do we set those structures up? And then it's up to Parliament to legislate. But there aren't many examples of that around the world, and then you've also got to get onto that track.
Interesting, because I was going through the recommendations of the climate committee, and they said something like 87% cut in emissions by 2040 as per the 1990 level, and but you think that's going to sort of ensure that enough jobs are going to be created, enough, and that's, and energy costs have to come down.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the
think
UK,
that's the...
Yeah, I mean, the UK has done a lot of decarbonisation already, right? So we were off coal years ago, or kind of gradually coming off coal, and they've just shut the last coal mine. That was for other reasons. So the economics kind of got ahead. And it wasn't, I think the other thing is that was not a straightforward transition, right? Anyone who was in I grew up in an era of miners' strikes and so on. And so you kind of saw, it was a completely different argument then, but that was a painful transition that the country's undergone. We've also offshored a lot of our emissions. So I think it is feasible. What the jobs look like against that's hard to say. If you take a lot of these technologies, there are fewer jobs. The idea is you then move those jobs into other sectors, and there's a lot of work going on at the moment around skills and kind of how, and trying to, I think you can do it if you take that long-term view and sort of say, right, what is our economy going to look like by that year? What skills do we therefore need? And how do we get from A to B? You've got to plan it out. I think the problem we're going to see globally actually is because we don't have enough of these long-term plans. As the climate crisis crunches us, we're doing unplanned transitions and not planned transitions. And that's the kind of big kind of coming back to the kind of tragedy around Trump, and what that will delay those plans, which means we're more likely to kind of do those very sort of hasty transitions, because we are going to have to
absolutely
change at some point.
Absolutely.
And so this is really just a kind of delaying game, which is going to lead to more pain in the longer run, I think.
Interesting you mentioned about the coal issue in UK. India at some point of time, maybe 10 years from now, will have to do that switch. And the coal, the just transition questions do crop up that time. That, what do you do with all the coal miners or the families which are dependent on coal, is there any sort of takeaway lessons from UK's own transition from coal to?
I think it's I think it's going to have to be about planning it out. So it's kind of understanding, like you say, what is that? When does India have to get off coal? I mean, I think sooner than it thinks is probably the answer. I think what's been really interesting is, and you might will have more insight than I do, but I do remember in 2017, the last time President Trump dropped out of Paris, India and China were quite quick to say, we might think about it too. And I haven't heard that as much this time. Maybe a few rumblings, certainly not hearing that from China, but I don't know in India whether there is some sentiment around that. But I think what we've seen since then is a much clearer tying of we're going to, economic progress and renewable electricity, renewable energy are seen as much more tightly put together. We've had the energy mission here and things like that.
Exactly. And
I'm not I'm not going to pretend to be a deep expert on that, but I think that has been a change we've seen from the top of understanding that actually how do we use renewables to hit other development goals and have it as a path to development. So that's kind of step one. But I think I haven't necessarily seen what's our plan out of coal. And for the UK, it was obviously thermal coal first, and then we've still got sort of coke and coal in the mix from steel. So there's kind of those two big transitions that you need to make.
Absolutely. And Indian government still now doesn't have an official roadmap for the transition, for the just transition, but there are institutions which are working on it, working on the ground on this. Interesting. You referred to the fact that a lot of banks in the last couple of years have sort of reworded or backtracked on their net zero, whatever.
The Glasgow Financial Alliance, all that stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. So point is that, you see that having an impact on the climate finance flow globally, or is there, or are we sort of being alarmist?
I don't think we can ever be alarmist enough. I think people are being a bit too casual about this crisis. I think it's really disappointing from the banks. Now, I do think they are getting a deeper sense of risk. And you do wonder whether there are, there's some big ticket projects out there that you wonder whether they really will get funded. Because if you do a discounted cash flow out over 30 or 40 years of your asset life, banks know that years 20 to 40, they surely can't get a return. So who's investing in coal right now? Who's investing? So take an example, back to Trump, but, drill, baby, drill. And Exxon, who's not in any way climate hero. There's no, Exxon have been one of the worst, to be honest. Said, well, actually, we're not going to drill because the economics aren't there. And actually, we're fully maxed out in the US. So what are the reality, how much of this is rhetoric and how much is it going to play out? I don't know. I mean, of course, there will be more than there would have been. But are we going to see a sudden explosion of fossil fuels and coal mine? I'm not convinced by that, because I think that in the end, go back to that JP Morgan risk thing, they're going to have to price that in. They're going to have to price out, well, what happens, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? Is it realistic that I've got a 40-year asset on my hand? And that stranded asset risk is going up, and the understanding of that is going up. So I'm not sure. I don't want to be casual about it. I think it's really disheartening to see what's going on at the banks, but I don't know how that's going to play out yet. Are we going to see these huge investments in coal or fossil fuels? I don't know.
Interestingly, the climate group has been in India working with Indian governments and companies for the last 15 years.
Yes,
and pretty quietly, I would say.
Tell
me, from the time the climate group, of course, you joined them later, but but at the time they started working in India, could you take us through what sort of change in attitude of the governments and the businesses you have seen, towards climate over the last 15 odd years?
That's a good question, as in it's hard to answer. I think we work with very ambitious businesses here. So I'd say a lot of those tended to be out in front, understanding the issues. And we work with some Indian headquartered businesses and then a lot of global businesses who are, have major operations here and then therefore want to understand how to decarbonize. Certainly, I think, like along with the rest of the world, the kind of understanding has deepened, and I think we've seen, over the years, a sort of ebb and flow on how much companies want to speak out about it, how much they want to sort of push the government or go with the flow a bit. I think when I joined, we'd recently done a project on LED rollout, which was it was a really good project. Whereas we focused much more in recent years on corporate commitments. But then how do you translate those into action? So at the moment, we're doing a lot of work on steel, and we've got a big project on concrete. So I think along with the rest of the world, there's this evolution into the heavy industry companies moving from, they've always been quite serious here about energy efficiency, partly as, license to operate or understanding that's going to be a big cost, but also it's quite hard to do about some, there's a lot of those processes you can't do much about. So therefore, let's start with energy efficiency. But now we're seeing companies engaging much more in actually how are we going to make this transition. So that's been good to see. With state and regional governments, we work with, I think it's about 15 or so. We've done projects there, including something called the State Climate Fellows, which is putting professionals into state governments to help work directly on climate transition plans. And you can see those plans getting more ambitious over time. So that's all been good to see. So I'd say, general progress in that period, but like the rest of the world, none of it is ever fast enough for what we'd like to see. But we have very good, deep engagement with a small number of companies, I'd say, and that's been good. I had a nice email the other day from someone in an Indian company going, wow, what do you think about Java? So it's nice to be able to exchange the thoughts,
Well, RE100 and EV100 are two key flagship programs that you sort of, you steer. What sort of traction do you see for that? There are Indian companies which are part of the group.
Yeah, I think one of the differences between Indian companies maybe and sort of European or British or American companies is, particularly I'd say those kind of Western companies, they like to make a big commitment. They're like, we don't know how to get there, but we're going to make the commitment and then we're going to work it out. And what we've seen from Indian companies and actually others in other parts of Asia is more of a sense of, no, we want to know the whole path before we're going to make that commitment. And it's a different approach and that's fine. So we've had to adjust a bit. So for example, on the Steel Zero, that's a commitment to zero carbon steel by 2050. And no one really does quite know how to get there. There are interim moments. And so we've had a lot of UK companies signing up for that and other and American companies who are saying, we can see how to do 2030. So we'll make the commitment because that will take us there. What we're doing now in India is gathering a group that are almost pre-commitment who want to get onto that path. And at the moment are sort of signing up to say, we will explore that path, we'll get there soon. And we've been talking about that this week. So we're hoping to launch that in the next few weeks and focusing in on specific sectors. So what we do as an organisation is, we have our big global campaigns, but also we'll tailor those into the different markets we're in, understanding both sort of the culture of business in that market, but also where is the market on different issues. Our policy work now is getting very kind of market specific. So you can have a global policy goal that we need to, or we can say things like we need to reduce fossil fuel subsidies, but when you get into a market, you need to look quite specifically. So we've done a lot of work. For example, I was mentioning South Korea earlier, there's some very specific regulations there that say you can't put solar within 100 meters of residential dwellings. Well, the rest of the world has rolled out solar on residential. So that's going to stop you. And then you go there and people are like, well, South Korea can't really do solar. You're like, you could if you got rid of that regulation. It's in half the districts or something. So we're doing work there that's very specifically on how do you pull out that, where's that regulation come from? How do you get them to change it? Because that would unlock pent up investment from business. So it's that sort of approach.
Interesting. In India, climate, I think also your the fact that environment, climate, and the the weather issues, especially in Delhi, the pollution. Pollution has been something which has been on the headlines in Indian media for the last, especially during the winter months.
Yeah.
How do you sort of, link it up if you're talking of building a climate narrative for India to pollution, to climate, and to overall, the net zero goal? What sort of how do you sort of build it up in terms of a narrative?
I think you can show that the solutions to both are the same.
Okay.
I think if you go the route of like, well, let's demonstrate that climate is it is exacerbating the problem. We know that. But that's quite a tough scientific argument to make. And I go back to this thing of like, let me show you one more graph. I don't need to keep showing you graphs. What I can do is say, look, electric vehicles will solve these things. Cleaner energy will solve this. How is diesel playing in and all these sorts of things. I know there's a whole issue as well around farming and some of those practices. And so if you can link some of that together as well. But that isn't an area where I'm going to pretend to be an expert. But I think it's about showing that solutions to these problems are similar. And then looking at good practice from elsewhere. But again, I come back to these kind of, how do you get that narrative quite simple? And it's not a case of, well, let's solve air pollution and then get on to climate. It's like, how do we solve both these things at the same time? And there used to be, I've been working on sustainability too long now, but like as in too long to still feel like we're fighting the same battles. But there was always, there used to be this cartoon which everyone working in sustainability used to see. You've probably seen it, which is a bunch of people in the audience, and there's a lecturer saying, pointing to a list of benefits like cleaner air, better health, something, and there's someone in the audience going, but what if it's all a hoax? So that used to be the argument about climate change and saying, well, you can do all these things anyway, but so many of the solutions are the same. And I think if we can make that argument, it's much crisper than trying to, again, link, well, it's particulate matter in parts per million.
Exactly. And this is a headline which we have been sort of, dealing with every year, I think, and every winter for couple of months, we'll sort of, everybody will start talking about it. People will roll their sleeves, talk about it, and then we'll go back to lives as usual.
It's over. I mean, the advantage of the air pollution is you can actually see the issue. It's very visible. And people can feel it, more importantly, and it's kept inside, all that kind of stuff. So how do you use that as a kind of communications tool around, like, this is the problem we need to work on, I think it is critical.
You have been in the climate space for, I think, more than 2 decades now, close to 3 decades?
Yeah, don't say close to 3 decades.
Okay.
I can't be that old, can I? Yeah, maybe.
So, are there any sort of, you did mention to some of the myths, and are you in the sort of climate myths that you feel needs to be debunked, and, we need to sort of talk about them much more?
I think the main one is this point that that climate has been set up in opposition to economic development.
Okay.
And if we can unpack that, it's not, there's a lot of technologies, there are a lot of jobs out there. There are good, clean jobs. There's good, clean energy. As I say, the IEA has said solar energy is the cheapest form of energy in human history. So why is that not cheap? Why is that not really cheap? Like you say, it's fossil fuel subsidies completely distort markets, and we haven't managed to pass that on to people. And that's a political decision wherever that's being taken, whether it's just political kind of apathy or it's kind of deeper than that. That's going to vary, but we need to get that benefit of the cheap forms of energy through, and then we'll see how these things can go hand in hand. And I think the problem that's led to is there's a thought, and this was certainly used to be the approach in India of like, we're going to do these things sequentially. We'll develop and then we'll decarbonize. And I get the kind of, there's a really compelling argument, like, this is how the West developed. You all got rich. I mean, this is a bit the kind of common differentiator, right? But like, you got rich like this. This is what we need to do. But we also know that decarbonizing is really, really expensive. And there are ways to grow in a kind of zero carbon way. So it's how do we get off that quite fair kind of moralistic look at the rest of the world and saying, come on, it's our turn. But actually saying, where are the advantages for us in going this, and how do we actually get that route map which gets development? And I'm not just talking about India. This is coming up in lots of places. So I think that's the main myth. And I think, again, the other bits of it are, there's been a really good job of kind of, I don't know, probably not particularly in India, but particularly in the US, of like climate change is a left-wing issue. It's somehow identity politics. It's woke. I mean, this is UK. They keep talking about woke capitalism.
Yeah.
It's infuriating.
Yeah.
Because you're like, no, like you say, that the subsidies are distorting everything.
Exactly.
You're like, just... Oh.
It's plain economics, I think. No,
It's just plain economics. Again, I have some graphs for you. But so I think if we can get under, those are the sort of things we need to do. And I get frustrated because there's a lot of talk in climate world, like, you need a new narrative. And we do, but I think we then tend towards very elaborate narratives. And I wish we could kind of simplify and get it back to kind of improving people's lives, which we will do. If you could solve pollution in Delhi, you would make people's lives better, right?
Exactly.
And a lot of that will come through, zero carbon technology.
Thank you, Helen. Thanks for your time and the fact that we could take time off. And I understand that you need to run for.
Yes, I need to run. But thank you so much. It's been good to talk to you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks.